a lot of moments that made the Qatar GP like quite a unique weekend. I guess good and bad, depending on how you want to look at it. Definitely on the bad side, this unbelievable aftermath that we're kind of seeing, or not kind of, that we're definitely seeing and vocalizing and immediately saw from all the drivers, like health wise, and comments afterwards of during the race and how excruciatingly difficult it was, and the being sick mid race, almost fainting mid race. I mean, there's an unbelievable list of things that drivers said were occurring or happened after the race. And it brings up the wonderful question of the regulation and making sure that race conditions are optimized for safety for drivers. And maybe that needs to be considered when determining, certain race stints or just overall racing conditions, like for certain tracks, needs to be just maybe considered and monitored better. Because I don't think having drivers blacking out in corners while going hundreds of miles per hour is a great idea.
Understatement. Understatement of the century. Yeah, I have a list here of everything that we know about post this race. Most drivers couldn't even stand up and get out of the car, including what we saw with Alex Albon, who needed assistance to physically get out of his car. And by the way, if you don't know, the FIA have these safety rules in place where all the drivers need to be able to get out of their car within 5 seconds. So that's why there's mechanisms to unseatbelt yourself. And so basically, Alex Albon was so sick that if his car got in an accident or lit on fire, he wouldn't have been able to get himself out of the car. Just when we're talking about what this all means, Sargent actually had to retire mid-race because he was so unwell. Esteban Ocon threw up inside his helmet at lap 15. We are talking about drivers who are conditioned to do this consistently at a heightened thing, and Ocon was so sick and felt so awful that by lap 15 he was puking. Stroll was blacking out in all the high-speed corners, which, by the way, of the 16 corners is about 10 of them, for the last 20 to 25 laps of the race, he said, and immediately went to an ambulance to get carted to the hospital post-race. Russell said he kept feeling like he was about to faint, so similar to Stroll. Alonso felt so awful that he actually asked them to chuck a bucket of water on him during the pit stop. And this is Alonso, who's Mr. I'm super macho strong man. I don't need anything. And that's him saying he really, really doesn't feel good.
His seat was on fire.
Yeah.
Actually. Not actually, yeah. But it says what he says.
And this is just what we know about. Lando, in a post-race interview, said that more than half the drivers went and saw the med team post this race. This is a level of safety. If drivers are blacking out in corners, this could have turned so bad so quickly. And the only reason it didn't is because these are highly trained performance athletes. And I know a lot of people like to make fun of Stroll's skills, but the fact that he was able to keep the car on track despite consistently blacking out for 20 to 25 laps, that's insane.
His onboard footage of him getting out of the car and him walking, and you see he can't keep his balance and has to lean on in the ambulance. It is so terrifying to think that he was just operating the vehicle that he was
at 200
sitting
miles
in.
per hour.
Right, at any speed at all, but just it was a very frightening sight to see these drivers in that condition post race.
And we're 2 races from Singapore, which is supposed to be the nightmare race of the season, and every single driver, even the ones that didn't end up having to go to the hospital, said that this was the absolute worst race of their entire career. It was leaps and bounds worse than Singapore. There have been a lot of really bad takes about this. I will fundamentally never agree with that drivers are making a contract that is their life to do this. Like that, just because this is a high risk sport doesn't mean that they have to be subjected to things that can be fixed or conditions that are beyond unsafe. This is the same conversation we have when it is tsunami raining and there's no visibility and people get mad that the drivers aren't out on track. I do not watch F1 because there's a risk of someone dying. I watch F1 despite the fact that there's a risk of someone dying. That is not... I will never get behind the, like, glory. Oh, yes. Like, it would have been so great if, like, Stroll crashed out because he was passing out in the car. Like, it is not okay to put athletes in situations like this. And the fact that there is no system in place for the safety of the drivers to be monitored in the moment to then red flag the race in some way. And this is just going to continue to be an issue as weather gets more extreme with global warming. So I am not hopeful, but I am hoping for the FIA to start figuring out how to monitor this now and put something in place now, or we are going to see drivers start to die because of things like this.
Yeah, it's not something that can be taken lightly, and I mean, anyone that makes the argument of like, this is what they've signed up for, it's like, no, I mean, no one signs up for dying at their day job. And also, like, an overwhelming amount of the race calendar, this is not the conditions that are being raced in. So, like, no, it's not what they signed up for. I also agree. I'm optimistic. I'm hoping that this is, like, enough public backlash and pressure and, like, just circumstantial evidence, or just it being the right thing to do, that there just be a little bit more regulations in this sense. And maybe, I mean, there was just so many of, drivers are always pushing themselves to the limits, so there's also the factor of, like, the, pushing to the 18 lap per tire thing, and, like, everyone's going as much as they possibly can, but you kind of always, that's what drivers are kind of always saying that they're doing. So there has to be a little bit more regulating of the conditions per track. I don't know.
It's also like the same. I know I compare things to the NFL all the time. I'm sorry, it's my second love. But a lot of this falls in line. Like, you have to protect athletes because they are not wired to protect themselves. Like, do you know how much pressure is on Lance right now? And he probably should have removed himself from that race, but he can't do that because of how much pressure is on him to perform right now. And in the NFL, we had the same conversation with concussions all the time, where everyone's like, well, if a NFL player actually has a concussion, they should remove themselves from the game. But they would never do that because it's their job and their livelihood, and they're so competitive. And F1 drivers have a similar kind of thing as NFL players, where you can lose your job like that. Like,
your 53-man roster sounds huge, and that's, like, not a huge thing at all. I mean, you could also make the case that, like, the argument of, like, not necessarily they're gonna know when to say no. You could hear in Logan's radio, and currently the state of his career, not ideal. The state of his seat, probably really up in the air of, if it all not already decided, like, him making that choice on the radio that's also then being publicized on television of him choosing to retire from that race before everyone knows about everything else going on, doesn't look too great on him at all.
No.
Yeah.
And then you have these awful macho men online, like, this is why you do this. It's like, no, you protect people. Like, they shouldn't have to do this for their job. And that will always be something I'm so passionate about in sports, that, like, regulating bodies need to be there to protect their athletes, to make sure this is as safe as possible. We should never be making arguments in favor of making a sport less safe.
An individual athlete, to your point of, is for their livelihood, for their job, like, they're always going to want to be saying they're going to do their job. But when an organization, like within Formula One or within the NFL, and they're able to see, like, proven causes of concussions or the lasting effects of XYZ concussions, things with driving, anything like that, like it's becomes your responsibility as that organization to be looking after the people that are getting involved in your sport, or else like what you see no value in them after your sport or the longevity or their life, or they're just disposable to you. It's icky. It's yucky.
It's literally one of the two things the FIA is in charge of. They're in charge of safety and they're in charge of regulations. But that being said, I have a very low bar for the FIA doing well. And they actually did put out a statement this week that they're looking into ways to solve this problem and monitor this problem and to make sure that the drivers aren't being put into an unsafe position like this again. Because again, we want to see athletes challenge themselves. And that's why we have races like Singapore that are hard, but for reasons like this. But I will also point out that this race is supposed to be slightly later in the year next year, so it should be cooler. But most experts say it's really not going to be that much cooler next year. So this will come up again next year. So I hope so good on the FIA for putting out a statement that they're actually going to care about it, but they've done that before and we need them to follow through and coming up with a way to do this.
Now you've said the words, now do things about the words. Thank you for listening to this highlight of episode 38 of Grid Walk. Don't forget to like and subscribe for a ton of more F1 videos. And you've made it this far into this video, so why not just go watch the rest of the podcast? Click here for the full thing. Ready? Come on. Follow my hand. Whoop, click right here. Click, click, click. Click, 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 click.